Welcome to the O1 unit, section 1, titled Early Americans. In section 1, we're going to talk about early Americans' migration into the Western Hemisphere. This migration began sometime around 38,000 BC, and that stands for before Christ, or if you're going to college, it's going to be referred to BCE, which is before Common Era. The first peoples to come to North America crossed the Bering Strait, where the mouse is pointing, across into Alaska, and then different routes through North America, Central America, down to South America. And this migration lasted thousands and thousands of years. It didn't just happen overnight. In order to understand this unit, you've got to understand that Native Americans migrated and settled in different parts of the New World. They settled in the Southwest. They settled in an area known as the Great Basin. They settled in an area known as the Great Plains. They settled in the Eastern Woodlands, and they settled in the Northwest. And what we're mostly concentrating on are the Native Americans in our present day country. In world history, you discussed Native American tribes like the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Incas. Their civilizations were centered in Central America and in South America. To begin with, we're going to talk about Native Americans in the Southwest, and that group is the Pueblos. And the Pueblos are signified here in yellow on the map right here. And the Pueblos are characterized one way by the dwellings in which they lived in. They mostly, because of the lack of trees and the ability to build wooden houses, lived in cliffs, mud cliffs. They also used the sand to form bricks using water to build houses with, and these houses were known as adobe houses. They survived mostly by agriculture using a technique known as irrigation, and that is taking water where it existed and moving it to where they wanted to place fields. And so they became very good in desert, arid climates, producing food. And that's definitely a characteristic of the Pueblo. The Great Basin area is the group that we're going to talk about is called the Paiute. And here, this map demonstrates the Great Basin area. It's between the Sierra Nevada mountains and the Rocky Mountains. It's very much desert, and it lacks a lot of natural resources, which leads to the characteristic of this Native American group being a largely mobile lifestyle. One characteristic of the Indians that lived in the Great Basin was a culture which included something called the ghost dance. And because of the lack of resources, the Paiute came to depend upon their dead ancestors. They would do ceremonies to try to get help from their dead ancestors to come back and help them, whether it be warfare or whether it be food. They used primitive tools like rabbit sticks and things called digging sticks, and this was because of the highly mobile lifestyle. The sticks that they used to kill small animals with were similar to the Aborigines of Australia, like the boomerang, and this is a digging stick that they would use to find water. The next group we're going to talk about are the Eastern Woodland Indians, and they're signified on this map in green up in this area, up around the Great Lakes, up in what is today the northeastern part of the United States. And the Indian confederation that we're going to talk about here is known as the Iroquois. The Iroquois were made up of 5 nations of Indians: the Cayugas, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, and the Senecas. And during the Revolutionary War, they actually allied themselves with the British. The characteristic of the Iroquois nation, beyond their ability to govern themselves as a nation or a confederacy of Indians, was the level of control that women had in their society. They played a tremendous role in the governance of the tribes and had much more influence on the governance of the tribes than European women. Last group that we're going to talk about were in the northwestern part of what is today the United States, signified in dark blue up here in the top left-hand corner. And this group was known as, or one of the Native American groups that characterized this region was known as the Chinook. And the Chinook were known in the Northwest for their totem poles. Their totem poles were sort of, I tell students, sort of like advertisements for their ancestors, for their spirits. They would use these as symbols for their tribes. The Chinook were characterized by, because of the geography and the climate that they lived in, for their fishing and their trade, and even whaling for large animals out in the ocean known as whales. They were good at killing those, butchering those, and using all parts of the whale, much like the Great Plains Indians depended on buffalo hunting. One characteristic of the Chinook was that they would bind their children's heads. At birth, they would place these boards on their head and flatten their children's heads out. This was a sign of social class, social status. Chinook also lived in longhouses. They shared this characteristic with their another Native American tribe in the Northeast called the Iroquois. And the characteristic is that because they were stationary and stayed in one place for long periods of time, they had extended families. More than 50 people might live in this longhouse: aunts, cousins, grandmas, granddaddies. One last characteristic of the Northwestern Indians was a party that they would hold called a potlatch. Potlatches would be a ritual in which one Native American family would give all their possessions away to other families in the culture group. And the goal was that eventually everyone in the tribe would own about the same amount of stuff, and that would bring about equality. This concludes Unit 1, Section 1, Early Americans and their migration and development in the Western Hemisphere.